Hey folks, quick lecture here on textual interpretation. And while textual interpretation might be super essential to reading political theory, reading political philosophy, I would argue that it is a general approach to understanding, comprehending, using text of all kinds, written texts from novels to histories to pieces of political theory, political science. Also, things like plays, things like speeches, textual interpretation, things like laws. It applies to all kinds of things. So let's jump right in. So, a key question we have to ask is why do we read any given text, right? There are millions and millions of different texts out there that we can read, books, journals, laws, political documents, letters of all kinds. Why do we pick some? Why do we pick certain authors? Why do we pick certain works by those authors? In answering those questions, I think we get some hints to sort of what the whole game of interpretation is about. Um, so I have four sort of broad reasons why we might choose to read a certain text. So the first reason is the one that I think is the most obvious, right? It says something original, insightful, profound, useful. Insert your adjective. There's something really good about the work. If nobody had ever read this book that I'm holding, this letter that I'm holding, they would read it and they'd be like, the first person who read it would be like, wow, like this is so interesting. This piece of literature, this piece of analysis captures something essential about the human condition. There's something in it that I don't care who it was written by. I don't care who else has read it. There's something valuable in the words, in the ideas expressed in this piece of text. That's one thing, right? But that's certainly, not the only or even the primary reason why we read any given piece of text, and that's especially true in a class where we are going back and reading very antiquated writings of all sorts. So another reason, a second reason, is that it's influenced important thinkers or politicians or societies. It's influenced and guided and shaped things that we do care about, even if we don't care about the text itself. Other people have read it, other people have made certain meanings out of it, and that has guided the development of constitutions, right? We might care about Locke or Plato, going all the way back to Plato or Aristotle, because the framers of the American Constitution read those works. And so, going back and reading those original works helps us understand the things we care about. What was motivating the framers as they drafted the Constitution? Well, maybe reading some of the political theory that they read would help us understand that. Or maybe you don't care about Plato, but maybe you care about Aristotle. Well, you're not going to get that far in understanding Aristotle unless you read some Plato first, right? Because they're deeply intertwined, teacher and student. So it may not be that we care about an original text on its own, but maybe putting it in conversation with other texts illuminates the text we care more about. A third reason is that the text happens to be widely read and known. And I think that this can be important for a number of reasons, but for me, most centrally, it allows us to have conversations about the ideas that are embedded in or related to that text, in the sense that I can give you an example, I can point to something that I know we've both read or we've both heard of, or that we both have sort of a common starting point with, and it can be a way for us to discuss those ideas. And so this again applies, hey, everybody's read Plato's Republic. They've all read Book 7, The Cave. So when I say, hey, it's like Plato wrote in the cave with the shadows and the reflections, that gives us some basic understanding in which to start a discussion. And this works, I think, I often say in popular culture. Most of us have read Harry Potter. So when I make a reference to Voldemort, it makes sense to people. You don't have to go look that up. Whereas if I made some reference to some obscure series that I'm reading I read the Expanse series with my son. It's like Avasarala always says. People don't know what I'm talking about, and so it doesn't provide that same common starting point for us to have a discussion and for us to offer examples and offer sort of points of comparison to each other. And then related to that, but distinct, is that a certain text might lend political or social authority to your views. And so right down here at the bottom, I have Jefferson and Hamilton in the Broadway musical Hamilton, which we care about these individuals and what they've said, in part because we consider their views of the Constitution to be authoritative. So when there's that whole, he's writing like he's running out of time segment in Hamilton, look at all the papers he wrote in the Federalist Papers. We care about that because if you can show in one of the Federalist Papers that Hamilton or Madison shares your view about what America is and what the Constitution means, there's authority in their text, and you can pick up that authority and use it for your own ends, right? And so this is one of the reasons why I'm always in classes when you guys are writing papers say, quote the text. The text is authoritative. It means something. And certain authors, Plato, Locke, the Federalist Papers, in certain cultures and political contexts mean extra. They mean more. George Washington said that. Well, then I guess it must be true, right? That's a good way to win an argument in American politics. And so that alone is why we read many texts, is because other people think that they're important. Sometimes you got to meet other people where they are, particularly in politics, right? So moving on. Here's an example, right? A text that was old and, Jefferson wrote it and it went back and forth. There were different drafts. Things came in and out of it. And yet we keep bringing it up, right? Over and over and over again. Frankly, to be clear, the Declaration of Independence doesn't have any legal statutory meaning for the United States, right? The Constitution determines and structures our government. It is, right? It constitutes our government. The Declaration, no, right? And in fact, the Declaration of Independence faded out of view. It was kind of like a quaint thing. Oh, one of those things that was written in the Revolution. Isn't that nice? Between the time of the Revolution and the time of the Civil War, and one of Lincoln's great accomplishments as president is to read the Declaration of Independence back into our polity and our Constitution as sort of the founding creed and the core meaning of America. And so, it has power, it has resonance, but that's not necessarily inherent to it, right? It's not that the words are the best words, and it might not even be right that it's important what Jefferson meant. It's just that it has a collective importance to us, and so that'll get us to some real questions of textual interpretation, and specifically, and this one copied a little bit funny, but that most famous of lines from the Declaration, and it's actually right. It's that all men are created equal, right? And we always come back to this in a lot of classes. Right? If you go to any famous speech, presidential speeches, the speeches of Frederick Douglass or Martin Luther King, all men are created equal, right? It comes up over and over again as the founding promise, the founding creed of America. But right? All, right? Do we mean all? Do we mean just Americans, American citizens? Do we mean people with property? Do we mean voting citizens? Who do we mean by all? And specifically, who do we mean? Men? Do we mean like men as different from women? Men as different from boys? Who are men? Who are all men? And created? Well, I mean, does that mean that at birth, all men, whoever all men are created equal, but between birth and death, they become unequal? Well, and what do we mean by equal? Do we mean that their capacities are equal? Do we mean that their moral value is equal? What does it mean to be equal? All men are created equal? Well, that's a pretty heavy, thick, value-laden phrase, and it could mean any number of things, right? So how do we figure out what it means, or how do we figure out what any text means? Not just any line, but any paragraph, any book, any sort of legacy across many works of a single author. What do we how do we figure out what meaning to give to their words and to their legacy of their works and their thoughts? So here are some approaches, and these terms are not used in every discipline. Some of them I'm taking actually from constitutional interpretation. Some of them are closer to what we might use in political theory, and they're not definitive, right? I think that they're just they're terms that help us sort of understand these different approaches. And every time you read a text, you're going to probably be using multiple approaches and multiple ways of thinking, and you won't be using them consciously. But it's worth spelling them out, because these are the things that are probably coming across your mind. So, first off, right, textual. What do the plain words say? All men, right? All right, all males, adult males, I guess, men. It's the clearest meaning of men. Are created, right? Well, when they're made, does that mean born? Is the clearest understanding of that born, or is there some metaphysical, God created the universe and is beyond time, and creation encompasses all of time, past, present, and future. I'm getting a little heavy here, but created, maybe equal, the same value, the same description. Well, I don't know. How should we interpret that? So this might be like difficult in the sort of most abstract types of language. But when we get to things like constitutional interpretation, and it says that the president must be 35, well, it must be 35 years old. That doesn't mean middle-aged, because that's how old middle age was. It means 35, count the years, right? So that's the textual interpretation of a very clear piece of text. But right, this doesn't necessarily get us far in every case. What was the original interpretation? In constitutional interpretation, you hear about originalism a lot. And essentially what it means is, what did the people who first heard this, the audience that first this would have been presented to, mean? Now, that's especially important in constitutional interpretation, because usually it's the people who elected or ratified a document like the Constitution. Well, what did they understand? Even if they didn't write it, they're voting on it. What did they understand it to mean when they were voting on it? But this might be useful. What did the people in Machiavelli's time think he was saying? Whatever they thought he was saying at that time, maybe we should stick with that. But in many cases, we might be using this sort of, these textual and original clues to figure out, what did the author mean, right? And so one of the main sort of approaches to textual interpretation that takes the author's intentions as sort of the gold standard, right? There is a meaning, we need to discover it. And what it means to discover it is to get as close as possible to what the author of the text was trying to say. But that's complicated for a number of reasons. One of those reasons is, do we mean like what they publicly meant to say? Machiavelli, when he's writing for, or Hobbes or Locke, when they are writing for kings and princes, and they're trying to, secure employment, they're trying to keep from getting killed. Is that what we mean? Privately, what they really thought, what they've maybe embedded secretly in the text, or what, the kind of double meanings they've given, or the ambiguous meanings, and maybe they're hoping that King so-and-so interprets it one way, that the church, right? So much of history, religious authorities, you don't want to get on their bad side. No one expects the Spanish Inquisition. So maybe you write in ambiguous terms, and really there's a true meaning, what the author would have written if they had been able to. But then there's also, right, so is it across the whole text, the entire document, the entire book, or all of the author's work over time? Maybe their views change. Maybe their views are inconsistent. Maybe they're not sure. Maybe they're trying one view on for size here and another somewhere else. Maybe if you challenged the author, they would, well, you say this here and this there. Which is it? They would actually be able to say, oh, well, in draft two, if I did another draft of those works, I would change it to mean this. Or at the end of is what they meant at the end of their life, how they would have interpreted what they wrote. Is that more important than what they meant when they wrote that? So if they die 30 years later, if Madison, dies and 30 years later his views on the role of party have evolved, does that mean that Federalist 10 and Federalist 51 means something else? Madison's views, and it's his work? Or do we care about, hey, the original readers, what did they mean? Or the author, does, 30-year-old Madison, what 30-year-old Madison meant is what it means. It doesn't matter what 50-year-old Madison thinks about the text. So you can see the complexity here. And right, we can do that with Jefferson and the Declaration. We can use all these different interpretations. Now, then there's principled. Well, you know what? Jefferson said all men are created equal. And, at the time he meant all, white men in America of a certain class, maybe, or we might, right, we might dither and disagree about exactly who he meant. In the Dred Scott decision, the court says, oh, this is who, only white men. That's who was meant, right? Not women, not Black Americans, not Native Americans. White men is who was meant originally and how the text was understood when it was written. Well, we might ask, yeah, but the core sentiment in all men are created equal is the idea that everyone who matters, everyone who is part of the polity, is an equal member of the polity. Well, today, people of all, gender, race, class, whatever, are full members of the polity. So in that context, in those circumstances, given our current knowledge about race and about gender and things like that, if Jefferson understood and embraced things that we all know or believe today, when he had written all men are created equal, he would have meant everyone is created equal, right? So we might say that, the author would have meant it, right? And so this is important because people who, Plato, so Socrates, right? Socrates, one of the most famous depictions of Socrates is from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. And the whole premise of that movie is that they go back in time and grab a bunch of historical figures to answer the question, what would these people have thought about San Dimas at the end of the 20th century? And so they go grab all of these figures, including Socrates, who they famously call Socrates. So if you call Socrates Socrates, that is okay in this class. But they bring them to San Dimas in California, and they show them around the mall and the amusement park with the water slides and things like that. And then they, ask them to give their opinions. And it's like, this is stuff that that all of those people never could have imagined. What would Thomas Jefferson have thought about, the military and military power and standing armies in a world with, where you can sit in a bunker and launch drones and launch missiles and kill people from thousands of miles away? Who knows, right? But maybe we can make our best guess, given the core principles of the work, how it might apply to different circumstances. And for instance, I just did this in another class. Jefferson was deeply, deeply, deeply involved in the debates over natural history at the time. So, evolution, species, race. If he had understood modern conceptions of, no, there are not physically distinct, biologically distinct races. would he have applied his thoughts differently? So can we update them? Can we make them consistent with the things we know now? Can we project forward, keep the stuff that was sort of at the core of that and apply it to new things, right? So how much can we do that? And then finally, post-structural, this is sort of a funny term here, but essentially what it means is these other approaches, particularly sort of the first ones, primarily this authorial one, but also to a great extent this principled one. What are the core principles? What's the gist of the work? Those all focus on finding meanings in what the author intended, what the author would have thought, what the author believed. Post-structural approaches basically say the meaning is ours to make, right? It's the readers who make up the meaning of a work. And it doesn't necessarily mean that I can step in and make the book, the novel, the text, whatever I want. But the idea is that, forget the authors. The authors of all these things are dead. And the second that they put out their works, they don't own them anymore. It's the reader who owns them. So socially, we create the meaning as we use them. And frankly, remember, there are thousands, millions and millions of texts that we could pick up. If we don't make useful meaning out of the text that we're using, then let them fade away. We don't need them anymore, right? So there's this post-structural focus on the reader. What's useful to us, right? If this is going to mean something to us, if we're going to keep reading Locke, if we're going to keep reading Plato, what does it have to mean, right? And so this has much more to do with where we are at, the questions that are important to us, the meaning that we want to make, the puzzles we want to figure out. It's a reader-centered, socially centered approach, right? And so then we get this question, is there just one meaning? And the answer, I think, has to be no, right? That there's ambiguity in every text. Every text can bear multiple interpretations. And you have to live with that. That's one of the things that's difficult about political theory or constitutional interpretation, or we're so used to wanting an answer. What is the right answer? What does this text mean? What is the one answer? You're not going to get that, right? You're going to have a debate. Now, that said, when we interpret, when we make meaning, there may not be one right interpretation, may not be one right use of the text, but there are better and worse. And better ones make use of the text, maybe make use of the history to some extent of the life and the context in which the author wrote. But most importantly, the text needs to bear it. The words, the text as a whole, the various things the author said, the tradition that the author was embedded in, it needs to make some sense. And so, again, we want to go back to the text, and as we're arguing for a meaning, we want to pull out quotes. We want to point to specific elements of the text. We want to reference the people who the author wrote, because it helps our interpretation, whether we're trying to find the author's answer or whether we're trying to create a socially useful, a meaningful, sort of new modern version of that text's meaning. You still want to dig into the text itself. All right, this is a little bit longer than I had wanted, and I think this is my last slide. Yeah, all right, so we have our various ways of interpreting a text. And again, I'm going to take you back into the law and away from Plato and Aristotle and Machiavelli and all of these people. Although, by the way, this idea of, is there one true view of that author? Plato, the early Plato, the late Plato, the Plato where maybe his views are more Socrates, the Plato where maybe his views differ from Socrates. Difficult stuff, right? Even within a dialogue, are all of the characters his view? Is Socrates' character his view? A lot of interpretive questions. Machiavelli, is there one Machiavelli? Is the Prince and the discourses on Livy, are they him saying two different things? Do we have to combine them together to figure out the true Machiavelli? Is one, is the other? All right, I know. I'm getting ahead of myself here, but bringing it back to law, right? The Eighth Amendment. This is one, when we're talking about constitutional interpretation, we often come down to. Excessive bail, right? Pretty easy textual interpretation that, all right, bail is bail. We understand it has a specific meaning. It's what it's what you pay to get out of jail while you're awaiting trial. Okay. All right. So that's what we know. But what about cruel and unusual punishment? No cruel and unusual punishment shall be inflicted. It's in the Constitution, the Eighth Amendment. Well, what does that mean? Does it mean, is there a clear textual meaning? I don't think so. I mean, we could go pick up a dictionary from the time, look up cruel, look up unusual, or we could pick up a dictionary today, look up cruel, look up unusual. It probably is not going to give us a clear idea of what punishments count. Well, what did people originally think it meant? Well, one way we could do that is ask what kinds of laws existed, and well, if they were executing people at the time, and then the people who wrote it and the people who passed it, who ratified that amendment, couldn't have thought that execution was cruel or unusual. Did they think that corporal punishment like whippings and floggings? No, they didn't think that was cruel or unusual. So that's one way, right? That's the way that Justice Scalia wrote about interpreting the Eighth Amendment. But it's not the only way. Maybe it meant, as the court in the 70s started interpreting, maybe it meant that, based on society's evolving standards, or even the world's evolving standards, what is cruel today? What is cruel in the 21st century might be something that is entirely different from something that's cruel in the 17th century or the 18th century. Consider executing children, executing a 15-year-old. Not cruel then. Today we now consider it to be unconstitutional because we think that in the late 20th, early 21st century, it's not justified, it's not humane, it's not necessary, and therefore it is cruel to kill people who are not of mature enough age to understand their crimes. We think that those principles are embedded in this original text, and so we think this text is best interpreted, even though its writers and its ratifiers didn't believe that executing 15-year-olds was cruel. We now believe that's what that text means. Right? So texts certainly do evolve, and this is just one way that explicitly we can consider that. Or we could say, hey, you know what? This text is here. It's in the Constitution. That's the main avenue we have for discussing and debating what kinds of punishments we should have, what we shouldn't. We don't care what they meant. We don't care what people in the past have thought it means. Let's use this as the way, whatever we don't want to be happening in our criminal justice system, let's call that cruel and unusual, because there's a tool here for us to say, bad types of punishment are unconstitutional. So a post-structuralist reading, and now that's a very crude post-structuralist reading, but we could talk more about philosophers and about modern values and things like that in a way that is much more divorced from the original meanings, and that's a much more post-structural approach. But I'll also give you another example here. Right, this is a more recent one. It's not constitutional; it's statutory. Just this last Supreme Court term, we had a case, Bostock v. Clayton, where the court, and specifically writing for a 5-justice majority, Justice Neil Gorsuch, took a textual approach to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and specifically the claim that employers shall not discriminate on the basis of race, religion, but specifically shall not discriminate on the basis of sex. And they had a decision to make in two different cases about whether or not that seminal law in our U.S. history, written right 1964, whether or not, when they said no discrimination, no employment discrimination on the basis of sex, they meant also on the basis of sexual orientation or transgender status. And you know what? It doesn't say those things. They weren't thinking about those things. The authors, we don't know what they thought, but they probably weren't considering that when they said on the basis of sex. What were the principles? Well, equality. We don't want discrimination against vulnerable groups that we now recognize as worthy of dignity. Well, that might help us out. But what Neil did is he went back and he said, well, what's the plain meaning? Well, don't discriminate based on sex. And you know what? He said, I think if your sex is male and you're having, relationships with men, and I fire you for it, it's because I'm saying you're not doing male sex right. It's on the basis of if you were female, I wouldn't have any problem with the relationships you're having. It's on the basis of your sex, plain textual meaning, Neil says. Same thing. Whereas if you are identified as female at birth and you now live your life as a man, well, you're not. If I fire you for that, I'm firing you because you're not doing sex as was assigned to you at birth properly. You're doing it wrong. So it's on the basis of sex. Right? And you could get to that interpretation that the '64 Civil Rights Act should mean that from a non-author based post-structural principled approach. It's the right thing to do to interpret it that way. Neil took a different approach. He took a textualist approach, a little less originalist, a little more textualist. But now that's what that text means. And I'm sorry that I'm doing so much constitutional stuff here, but this is what helped me understand as a reader, that when I go back and I read Plato or Aristotle or Locke, and when I'm reading Locke talking about how we're responsible for the welfare of our fellow citizens, and he's not thinking about taxation and redistribution in the modern welfare state, but how does it apply? People often interpret Locke as very libertarian, but maybe this line in Locke, interpreted in terms of our current context, means that Locke would have been a socialist, he would have been a Bernie Sanders democratic socialist, right? There are different ways that we can make use of the text, and I think that whether we're reading a novel or a play or a constitution or a law or a piece of political theory or philosophy, these same kind of approaches apply. All right, sorry this was so long, but I hope it was useful as we move forward.